Hey, this is Chad with Be Gone for Good. Today we're going to go through a real kind of raw and gritty version of the assembly for the AltRider Crash Bars. Upper, lower, and then that middle section that kind of ties everything together. I took the video as best I could to make sure that you could see each bolt that was going in, the entire setup and process along the entire way, but it's not great footage. Obviously, it's just a handheld camera. If you have any questions, anything that you really need some help with, obviously AltRider's customer service is fantastic and they can help you out, or you can drop me a line. I can see if I can get you any better video or better images of the process as it went along the way. But hopefully this gets you at least a pretty good basis for an understanding of how the bars go together. There's a couple of tricky points, especially if you're installing the entire system, where you want to make sure that you're doing it in the proper order. Otherwise, you're going to have to redo everything and go back and loosen a bunch of bolts that you didn't necessarily have to if you did it the proper way. So make sure you go through the video, make sure that you read the directions thoroughly. If you're doing the entire system, make sure that you're paying attention to how everything goes on, because it will be important and save you a lot of time and effort down the line.
Okay, this is Chad with Be Gone for Good. We're going to be installing the AltRider Crash Bars for the Honda Twin. I got the full set, so that will be the upper, the lower, and then the bridge that connects the two of them. This first portion is the bracket that goes in just underneath the tank that both the top and the bottom, the upper and the lower, will both attach to. This seemed to be the right place to start, but we'll see as I get a little bit deeper into this if maybe I'm making a mistake. The AltRider instructions are pretty fantastic because they come with instructions about exactly what you need to get started. Great pictures for each section as well, so you really have a good handle on what you're going to be doing in each step. The things that were required or expected were two 12mm spanners. I only have one because I'm very poor after spending close to $700 on these crash bars. So I have a 12 spanner and I got a 12 socket, hoping that that'll work. There is a 13mm spanner, which you see there, as well as a 13mm and a 17mm socket. There's a 6mm hex Allen tool, which I don't have here yet. The ratchet handle, the extension, and there's some thread locker that I've got still in the package ready to go. Then you've got the two brackets down here and all the hardware to mount them. These brackets are incredibly heavy duty. They're really thick. They feel like they're really pretty sturdy. So I'm very happy with the brackets so far. And now I'll look at mounting, and hopefully this goes as easily as I expect it to. These are the instructions I was telling you about. Very clear. They show each step that you're going to be making. It tells you the bolts that you're going to be touching and taking off. Great pictures in here. Very detailed instructions. This is a fantastic resource to be able to make this a garage fix for you. Obviously, crash bars are not the most complicated things in the world to install or work on the bike. But this does inspire a lot of confidence in even novice wrench turners that this is something that you can get done. And at worst case scenario, if it's something that you need help with, you can jump on the forums and talk exactly about which step you're having struggles with, and there'll be people out there that'll be able to help you out from that point on. So the first step we're going to be making is the brackets on either side of the central frame tube, just behind the headers. There'll be two bolts that we remove on either side, so that'll take care of 1 and 2 here. Those are our first two steps. This is where we'll be using our 12 spanners and hopefully a 12mm socket to be able to pop those off of there. Alright, the first two bolts we're going to remove. This one here and this one back here. We're going to have both of these removed, loosen initially. There's a washer behind both of these. That's really important to keep in there. So you got to make sure that you're sticking a hex head in there or something to make sure that that washer doesn't fall out on you. spacer, because it's really important to maintain that based on the instructions. All right, quick tip. The bolt that is marked A in section 1 here, instead of being 13 millimeters, is actually 14 millimeters. I used two 14 millimeter sockets to be able to get it broken loose, so no problem, but slight hiccup. Just make sure that you're using 14s instead of a 13 millimeter on that one. Okay, both bolts have been removed based on the instructions. Neither one of these will be used again, so you can take those both out there. As you can see, that hex head is in there to make sure that I don't lose any spacers, or that stays where it belongs. So those two are taken out. We will now fit the bracket and start getting those bolts bolted back in there. Alright, both bolts have been fit back through. You can see them there on the top and bottom. They said that if you have any difficulty getting the bolts through, and it was a little bit difficult, that you can loosen this nut a little bit. That'll allow you some play in these plates to be able to get that back screw in. And this front one went in very easy, actually. Just a point of reminder, as it was something that I had looked into as I was doing this, is the one in the back there is actually your hex head that you have. So that's the one that you've got, or excuse me, the one that you would be using a socket on is in the back there, and this one is the hex head. So make sure that you get those right as you insert them, and they should go in fairly easy. And if you don't, go ahead and loosen this one up, and that'll provide you the play that will get those in real easy. All right, the final nuts have been tightened. The upper, listed as the A screw, goes into a fixed nut on the bracket to 49 Newton meters. That's a pretty easy one to get to with a 17 millimeter socket on the opposite side. That's a pretty easy one to get into. And then the other bolt is under here. And it's this one right here. This one goes in to 21 Newton meters to lock that one in. And if you did loosen it, this front bolt here goes into 29 Newton meters, excuse me, 25 Newton meters. So you've got 49 in the back, 25 here, and 21 here. And once you get all of those assembled and put in, this one does not need Loctite because it is a locking nut. This back one, the 49 one, does have Loctite, which is included along with the bracket. Once those are all in, the bracket is officially installed, ready to go, ready to start with the upper and lower crash bars to be installed shortly.
For the upper crash bars, the first thing we're going to do is remove this nut here to install the bracket that screws in here, here, and there to hold the bars right here at the headlight. It looks like a pretty simple nut to remove. It's got a welded receiver on the backside over here, so it's just this one nut to remove, and then it should be good to go. Once your bolt is removed, go ahead and install the bracket, and you'll Loctite that bolt, which is 13 millimeter, comes in the kit, and put it back in place. Right there, they said to tighten loosely, just to make sure that it's holding, and then we'll get these front bolts attached in those screw holes up there, and then probably tighten the whole thing up to have this front bracket attached. All right, once you get done installing those two bolts, make sure to leave everything loose so that you have a little bit of play in the system for when you are attaching the upper crash bars to this centerpiece up here. You're going to want a little bit of movement in there. And then once everything is settled in and all put together, then you can tighten all the bolts down and really secure the system up completely.
When attaching both the upper and the lower crash bars to the center bracket, you want to make sure that the uppers go behind the lowers. As you can see here, you've got the bracket all the way in the back. You've got the upper crash bar right here in the middle, and then the lower crash bar right there, and then a bolt that goes straight through all three of them to hold. Same thing down here. A bolt goes through all three of them to hold that entire assembly together. This is on the left side, but that's going to be how it looks for the entire assembly to come together along with that center bracket. At the front of the bike, you have the two bars that come together with these 4 hex heads that go through there. Make sure that you get this attached and the entire assembly put together before you start screwing anything down tight, because getting these 2 slotted in there is a little bit difficult if you've already got some of the other areas tightened up. So once you get everything assembled and where it belongs, then you can start tightening down all your screws.
All right, the next step in the full crash bar installation is going to be the lower crash bars from AltRider. I have already established the center bracket just behind the frame on the lower part of the bike. So now I can move on to this. It includes the 2 bars, this bracket here, and it looks like a little bit of hardware. The whole process should be fairly self-explanatory, except for the disassembly, or at least loosening, of the muffler and the headers so that we can access the bolts from the underside of the bike. The first element that we need to take care of is removing this little clip here, which has the oxygen sensor, to give us a little bit of play in this wire that leads to the muffler that's just below it. So we'll have to unclip that first. The next element is going to be to take each one of these nuts, these 12 millimeter nuts, from the headers and loosen them. You're not supposed to remove them, just get them real loose so that you have a little bit of play in the headers and being able to move around so that we can get to the nuts that are at the back of the muffler. We will remove this nut at the muffler to release this rear catch, and then we'll fasten the muffler and still hold it on to the bracket with some safety wire, but just to give us a little vertical play in there so that we can get to the nuts that are just below. This seems like a pretty easy process, but I'm going to have to make sure that the muffler doesn't drop off completely and go slamming to the ground. The directions say to remove the upper exhaust hanging bolt first, but my suggestion would be to get this one first so that you can actually hang the muffler properly with the wire. This is the next step, is to remove this lower exhaust bolt, and once that's happened, then this whole exhaust should be able to drop down. I do not have the upper safety wired properly yet because obviously it hasn't dropped, but as soon as I get this bolt removed, then I'll get all that squared away. With the lower bolt removed, we now have everything tied the way that we want it. Muffler is hanging down, so we have access to the bolts underneath that will allow us to grab hold of the lower crash bar. For the left side lower, you'll first have to remove the skid plate, and then these 2 bolts here will have to be removed. I've moved the skid plate guard and this hose holder up a little bit, but once those come down, you'll be able to put the lower bar in with the supplied screws, attach a little bit of headlock or thread locker on there, and then reattach.
For these bottom bolts, obviously you're going to want to get everything attached before you start putting on a bash plate or anything along those lines. But they attach and go straight through the frame along with this little bracket here included. So make sure that you get that all attached at the same time in order to make sure that those bolts go through the proper areas.
For the 2 bolts on the front of the left lower crash bar, you're going to want to use the hex screws that came with the bracket itself. They did not come with the lower bar, they came with the bracket. So the screws that you use for that, they'll fit in there perfectly.
For the center assembly, you want to make sure that everything is attached there, and then you allow yourself the option to put the front bars in first, or the top bars in first, and then the lowers go on top of that outside, and they're all bolted with the same bolt. So the whole process kind of occurs all at once. Ideally, if you're only going to be installing uppers or lowers, you're going to want to put the uppers in first, and then the lowers just bolt right to the outside of those from there. It's a little bit more complicated if you want to get the uppers in afterwards, because then you have to pull the lowers completely off and allow yourself space to slot those uppers in behind them. Once you get that all in, obviously you crank these down. Make sure that you do it really tight. I already lost this bolt in a previous iteration, so make sure that you get them tight, and then I think they say about 100 miles after assembly, go ahead and check them again and make sure that all your torque values are where they belong still. On the right hand side, once you drop the muffler, the first piece that you're going to put in is this bracket back here. You're going to make sure that that's all assembled. Obviously that goes in and underneath the entire bike and the frame. Once you get that set, then you go ahead and put the lower bars on and screw those into that frame bracket. You're going to want to make sure that you leave this back bracket a little bit loose, just so that it makes it easier to fit your bottom bar. And then once everything's fit and you've got the bolts in, you can tighten everything down, and it makes the process a little bit easier. From there, once you get everything tightened down, then you can bring the muffler back up. Don't forget to reinstall your O2 sensor back in there. It's a little bit more difficult, obviously, now because you have this huge wedge in your way where you were normally sticking your finger or getting back there to be able to put that in there. So it can be done. It takes a little bit of work, but just make sure that you don't forget to reattach that O2 sensor back there, because that's going to be important. You don't want that dangling down. Once you have both your upper and your lower bars installed, you can install the middle piece. It has 2 separate clamps on there. One is a little bit bigger than the other. The bigger end obviously goes down for the lower bar, because that's a thicker bar. So make sure you clamp onto that with the bigger end. And then up here, you've got the thinner end. They both fit on there pretty easily. Make sure that you torque all those bolts down properly. And then once that's on there, your entire assembly is complete with uppers and lowers and your middle bar as well.